Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.
Marking the 10th anniversary of the end of combat operations in Afghanistan and 3 years since the evacuation of Kabul. This series brings us personal accounts of those who were there. Just over 150,000 UK Armed Forces personnel served in Afghanistan. These true life experiences have been difficult to talk about. They tackle challenging issues and may be emotionally difficult to hear. If you feel you may be sensitive to this, you may prefer not to listen.
Welcome to Land, Sea and Air. I'm Steve Bomford, co-founder of Company of Makers.
And I'm Tip Cullen, an actor and former Royal Marines Commando.
On this episode, we talk to Frank Ledwidge, and I'll just read the back of his book here. It says, in a hard-hitting piece of investigative journalism. I think that sums it up.
Yeah, Steve, I think it's those words alone leave me with a bit of trepidation listening to his chat, but I'm a willing sort of listener.
Yeah, I do think this could be a bit of a difficult listen for a lot of people, but we've got to hear what he has to say, I think.
Yeah, indeed.
Frank, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
So you sent me a copy of your book, Investment in Blood, The True Cost of Britain's Afghan War, which I have read, and I have to say it's an interesting read and quite a difficult read. But I would like to come on to that in a moment. First of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. You're not just an author, are you?
I started my career I'm from Liverpool, and I worked there for several years as a lawyer, criminal lawyer mainly, but all kinds of other stuff as well, which was interesting. And then in that time, I've been in the Army Reserves for a few years, so I knew the Army reasonably well. And was considering at one point joining the regular. And whilst in Liverpool, I joined the Navy Reserve, which was the primary reserve unit, because I was interested in doing something a bit different. So I did my training there as a naval officer. It was very, very, very good training, actually, on minesweepers. And after a couple of years of that, I joined one of the more discrete units of the Navy, which was essentially a joint service unit with the Army mainly, also the Air Force. And when the Bosnia thing came up, I got called up and spent several years there. I also did a later tour in Iraq as a military intelligence officer. The work I was doing was out on the ground. It wasn't really analytical. It was, out on patrols and what have you, doing the job we were doing. That was the reserve life, and I ended up, after 15 years of time in that unit, as head of branch, and then retired. So I haven't had anything to do with as part of the military for 16 years now, if that's right. But in real life, I worked a lot in international organisations and for the British government, and I have to stress here, not as in an intelligence role, but as a security and justice. So I worked in all of the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, quite a lot. This was a while ago, and the Balkans a very great deal for many years. Anyway, I also did some time in Afghanistan, which we'll come to, and later on in Libya. And over the last 2 years, I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine during the war there, doing various roles. Again, none of them spooky, as it were. But in around 2010, I wrote a book called Losing Small Wars about Iraq and Afghanistan and why it had all gone very wrong and who was responsible for that. And it did quite well, I think, especially amongst military people. And I was very proud to have so much support from those that end of things. Military people tend to be quite realistic. And after that, I wrote the book I think we'll discuss called Investment in Blood. And I must say that whilst I quite enjoyed writing Losing Small Wars as an intellectual challenge and a writing challenge, this book, for reasons we'll discuss, was less enjoyable to write. Anyway, we'll cut beyond that. And for the last 10 years, 12 years or so, I've been an academic. And all of my academic time has been involved with the Royal Air Force as a teacher of young officers and some more senior officers and senior NCOs, teaching them or discussing with them strategy, contemporary affairs, military matters. I've got some expertise in air power now. I wrote a book later on that too, soon to write another second edition of that. So yeah, I would call myself now a sort of military analyst or military academic. So that's pretty much me.
So quite an interesting and diverse career, I think. So onto the book itself, which is basically divided into three parts, and it's the human cost, the financial costs, and the for what. And obviously you've done an afterward, because this is at least a second edition book, isn't it? So
yeah,
you've just talked me through those elements of the book, so you can paint a picture of what the book is actually about, please.
So I did a tour, as they say, in Afghanistan, not as a military officer, but with the military in Helmand. I was one of the first civilian advisors there in 2007, over until 2008. I was justice advisor, which basically meant talking to a lot of prosecutors and lawyers and judges and things, writing reports and coming up with policies and whatnot. But it also meant I spoke to a lot of people. Again, I don't like to stay in the office and outside the wire, as it were. So I only did one tour because there was some issues at home, and but stayed very much in touch with the issues. And then, as I said, I wrote that other book. And then I thought, really, like so many people, the war was still going on, and it was very clear to me, as to very many others, military especially, that the thing was going downhill. And after Iraq, where I felt we'd been traduced and lied to, my job in Iraq, by the way, for what it's worth, was literally to look for weapons of mass destruction. And as listeners may know, that pretext was entirely false. Many people were killed trying to complete that task. A waste of time, to put it mildly, life and blood for a lot of people, including many hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. So after that, I went into Afghanistan sincerely believing that it was the good war. And I think a lot of listeners who are military will understand what I mean. We all thought this was the good war, that the enemy were evil and our side was essentially good, and we were going to defeat the enemy, we were going to replace them and sort that country out for good and all. And I think very many of us went into that, in the military case, very, very many times, did many tours on that basis. However, by around 2011-12, so the whole war started for us, really, the war that started, although campaign started before that, 2006, in Helmand. Now, Helmand is a province in southern Afghanistan. It's even Afghans regard it as dangerous and primitive, right? It's if you talk to people from Kabul, the capital, they would say, and many people say this, well, what are you doing down there? They're crazy down there. And because it's an extremely, still very tribal, it's rooted in its history, highly traditional, Pashtun, Pathan, whatever you want to call it, society. So that's where the British were. And as we may discuss, that was the worst place for the British to go. Although most of us didn't really know that at the time. Some people did. Some soldiers and academics who were really keyed in, they did know that was the worst place to go. But anyway, there we were. The war started there. Well, the fight started there in 2007, really, 6 to 7. And it went on. And despite the fact we were told time again, every tour, it was the tide was turning, the Taliban were on the back foot, we're in it for the long haul, victory's on the horizon, one more push, this offensive will do it, that operation will complete the task, etc., etc. It's very clear that by 2010, things were critical. And the Americans were called in, as they were in Basra, in Iraq, to bail us out. There's no other way of putting it. We can discuss that if you like. By 2011, things were sliding downhill, and we left in 2014 without going into too many details. So about halfway through that time, it's very clear this thing was done. It was a failed operation once again. We've been bailed out. But the cost to the British military, by our standards, was extremely high. Casualties were quite intensive in the sense, or put another way, there were relatively many casualties quite regularly, far more than in Iraq, or even in terms of the pace of casualties or Northern Ireland, far more. And so then the question had to be asked, so what are those costs? How many people have been killed or injured? What's the cost to us? Not just in, the numbers are clear. They were reported every day, or at least the killings were. And so I was keen to know what the human cost was, not just in physical terms, but also psychological terms. So we looked at that. And then, okay, fine. And so much for us, but we landed in this province of under 2 million people, about the same size as Northern Ireland, completely uninvited, by the way. When we got there, it was relatively peaceful. And when we left, it was the most intense war zone, or rather, when we were there, it was the most intense war zone on earth. We killed an awful lot of people there. And as one friend of mine said, I think a lot of them were the wrong people. So I wanted to look at the cost to the Afghans, and particularly Helmandis, of our operations, which are much clearer now, by the way, of course, than they were then. Seems to me very many people, but I'll draw a distinction between the operations of the Green or regular army, as they call it, and the special forces, and we can get to that. And then finally, asking the question, well, we were told that we were fighting terrorists in Helmand, which there were none, by the way. Al-Qaeda, there were no Al-Qaeda there. We were fighting whoever we were fighting, and that's another question. Who were we fighting in Helmand? So for what? And what was achieved? So I produced this book, Investment in Blood. I have to say, Steve, it was not an enjoyable write at all, for reasons you can imagine. It's relentlessly negative. There's no two ways about that.
Did you have a preconception, Frank, of what it would? I mean, obviously things were going south, as it were, as you've explained. Were you surprised by how challenging it was to write?
Yes. As I said, I'd written another book before that called Losing Small Wars. I think it's a set text in campaign studies and things. And I found I did enjoy writing that because it's very interesting. I found that it was congruent with, which is to say, most military people agreed with me. Indeed, the book was drawn from their views, not really mine. Not particularly clever enough to come up with a lot of the concepts that are in their ideas. And I really quite enjoyed that. It was dynamic. It was interesting. A lot of support. Yeah, I did not really expect to enjoy the investment in blood on Afghanistan because it's human. Far more focus on the human costs in that rather than the operational, strategic, tactical details, military nerdy stuff that's in Losing Small Wars and war stories and what have you. This is far more, it's relentlessly negative. So I didn't expect to enjoy it, but I didn't expect not to enjoy it as much as I didn't enjoy it. That's a really horrible phrase, but it was much more unpleasant to write than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
There is nothing positive in it. I'm not selling it very well, but that's not the point, is it? It was, yeah. Anyway, so I was quite keen after that to move on to something else, for what it's worth. And by the way, so was the country as we left in 2014. And we didn't really hear mention of it again, did we, until the appalling evacuation in 2021. I mean, people have followed it. I followed it very closely, actually, for those years, and kept in touch with a lot of people there, not just our military, but some Afghans and so forth. And it was very clear what was happening. But I think the country wanted to forget it, understandably so.
Coming back to the way the book's written and what you've written about, if we could just maybe touch on the three parts of the book. and firstly look at the human cost.
Yes, so that's divided in two. There's our costs to us and our soldiers. That's the most important part, really. And the financial costs, which are actually very interesting, and a lot more than, needless to say, a lot more than the government, the Ministry of Defence ever admitted to and continued not to admit to. So, most important aspect, I don't wish to demean anybody else, but we'll come to it. But from our perspective, of course, are our own soldiers. And the broad facts are fairly straightforward. 459, I think, killed in combat, and officially 2,500 people seriously injured. I believe the number is much higher than that, given the numbers of compensation awards that have been given. Hundreds of amputees, and very many people seriously psychologically damaged, including some very good friends of mine, one of whom I was in touch with this morning. Just mentioned I was doing this podcast. Who's just come back from some travels. He's had a very difficult time, but a lot of my friends have obviously I've got a lot of military friends, both from writing and my own service, and these costs continue now. So to put it in money, then let's start with the financial implications of thousands of people killed or injured, and it's not clear how many, as I say. So just to repeat the figures, about 3,000 killed or seriously injured in this campaign. That's quite a lot. That's not a small number, 3,000 killed or injured for us. It's more, in human terms, the most costly war in terms of casualties, aside from the 30-year war in Northern Ireland, but since Korea. And the intensity of fighting was similar in parts to that in Korea. Now, the important thing about costs of war is wars are extremely expensive to fight. So we've spent, I calculate, probably inflation adjusted between 50, Steve, and 60, this is inflation adjusted now, 5% a year or so, billion pounds just on fighting the war. The figure in 2013 was, I think, 40 billion. So somewhere between, let's say, 40 and 60 billion. Now, the 40 billion is a baseline. I can pretty much account for every one of those billions of pounds quite easily using government figures. It's different, but whilst the government has never denied those figures, I might say, and they were mentioned in Parliament, the government didn't deny them. What the government does is, though, it takes the lowest possible number it possibly can, and it folds one budget into another and all the usual conjuring they do. But the cost was, in cash terms, 40 billion. And now, of course, since we're paying the debt, it's a lot more than that. Now, that's just a start. So let's look at and that's just the military costs. So let's look at then the real costs, because the biggest cost of any war in Western societies is looking after the injured. I had the privilege to speak with the leading expert, a global expert on the costs of war, somebody called Linda Bilmes in Harvard University in America. And she told me that the costs of the Vietnam War peaked in the 90s and are still going on. Because, of course, if you're seriously injured or you're a veteran, your conditions get worse and worse. I'll come to that. So we haven't budgeted for looking after the injured, right? That cost is loaded onto the NHS, so there's no calculation as to that. But I put this question to Linda Bilmes at Harvard University. Well, how would we calculate it? Or how did you calculate it? So she said, well, look, she's a particular expert in the Iraq War. I don't want to get into the woods of this. If anybody's interested, read the book. She said that I estimate, she says, that the costs of the Iraq War, where they lost about 5,000 people killed and 100,000 injured, note those figures. Just 20 times injured and psychologically injured, killed. She said, I estimate, and get this figure, that and this was in 2013, $800 billion to look after the injured over a period of 50 years.
Wow.
In 2013 terms. So I said, well, we had about 1/10 the casualties you had, pro rata. How would you calculate ours? And she said, well, I don't know how to calculate yours because you have the NHS. But in principle, this is my comment, in principle, the same kind of care is required, right? So we're looking at billion. Nobody's calculated. So nobody seems to be bothered in the NHS or the Ministry of Defence about this. Just move on, forget it. Because, of course, it's loaded onto the NHS. Many billions of pounds to look after and take care, to the extent they are taken care of, our injured in this war. Many billions. And, of course, that's ongoing. I'll give an example. So a friend of mine he was very seriously injured in Iraq. Good close friend. So I'm pretty up to date with what's going on. And he got very badly injured in Iraq. And he told me that in the first few years of his recovery from this massive blast injuries, the cost, he was told by American surgeons, because it was initially treated by the Americans, was, as I recall it, $14 million, because of the nature of the surgery. That's how much it would cost. $14 million. And that's in US terms. Make your own calculations. So that's one guy. He also got a big award, and so he should have done, of nearly £600,000, and he's going to be paid for the rest of his life. And there are those people who, like, well-connected people like him, and like many other, largely officers, they can get access to that kind of award because they know where to look and they can get good lawyers. They lawyered up, but many people, of course, haven't had that social capital and can't lawyer up and don't know where to go. So I'll give you another example, and I'm not going to go on giving examples. It's just vignettes of the costs. So there's another guy, let's call him John. His name's not John. And John was a very modest person. He drives a van. And I got to know him through a particular veterans aid thing. I tried to help him with a legal issue. And to cut a long story short, John had been in Helmand, and he'd come out to the army, and he gone to jail for 2 years for GBH. By the way, he had no record of any criminal offence before that. He's 26, and no criminal offences, no major disciplinary offence in the army. He comes out. So I asked him. So he did 2 years, which he did a year in jail for this probably quite serious offence, I think. Anyway, that doesn't matter now. And I asked him, has it, you were in Helmand, were you ever in contact, which means in combat? And he said, yeah, I was, yeah. Actually, my friend got shot next to me. So he's a truck driver, actually, this fella. And truck driving in Helmand was very, very dangerous. You can imagine doing the convoys, and that's what he was doing. And he same in Iraq. So he lost his friend, shot next to him, and he got blown up a couple of times. So couldn't really hear out of one ear. And very well because of this. And that's a very common problem, which, again, often isn't addressed at all. And he had never had any assistance from his regiment or corps. Nobody showed up at his trial, by the way, to tell the judge that he'd been in Helmand, had his friend killed next to him, and he'd been blown up several times, which may have had some impact on his crime, of course. Mm-hmm. And we mustn't assume, by the way, that all military leaders or officers are constantly looking to the benefit of their people, because they're sometimes not. Most of the time they will, but nobody showed up for him. And I still can't really work out why. But anyway, maybe because he'd left and no one asked them. Also possible. And anyway, so that guy, I'm fairly certain, is still wandering around with impaired hearing, probably traumatic brain injury. Obviously I pointed him in whatever direction he did pointing in, but I don't know whether he did it. And I suspect there are thousands like him. And those costs are covert, right? No one knows about these costs, and I won't get into the homeless issues and what have you, and nor I will, however, get into suicides. So again, it is shocking that no one, and I think you know this, has credibly established how many suicides there have been. And I am certain that every service personnel who served in Helmand or Iraq, for that matter, knows somebody, or at least knows of somebody, who has killed themselves. But we don't keep those figures. In the United States, by the way, it's well known and well established and credibly established that there have been many more suicides than service personnel than killed in combat. And I think that's probably the case here, but nobody's checking. And one other thing, and it's very rarely mentioned this, and I think it should be very rarely mentioned, and I know a couple of people like this, is, they don't get much sympathy. But why not? Why shouldn't they? Because they're British guys trying to make a living for their families, and that's private security personnel or private military companies. These aren't mercenaries. These are people who use their military skills to guard people like me when we go out on our missions and meetings. And they took very high casualties, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And 99.x% of them, like 99.x% of soldiers, did not go around murdering people or shooting people like a lot of American ones did. They just don't do that. These are professional soldiers, but they took ferocious casualties. Those are entirely forgotten. And their families who are bereft are also entirely forgotten. When I was in Helmand, I went to one wake, as it were, for a guy, just in that short time I was there, from a PMC who had been murdered. And there are hundreds and hundreds of other British guys, very few girls in the PMC world, who have been killed as well. But we don't, and very badly injured, but we don't hear about them. But there we are. So that's the human cost, or just the beginnings of a discussion on the human costs. And I might add, just as one appendix to that, if I might, Steve, just for 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm,
the course. Ministry of Defence, and I don't want to sound like someone ranting here, but I can evidence this chapter and verse, is a vindictive and obstructive organisation when it comes to provide, or was, may have changed slightly, but I somehow doubt it, when it comes to the provision of assistance. It is, and the result is, by the way, that people who do get involved often, not always by any means, in the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme, what the Ministry of Defence will do, it will at every turn try and reduce its liabilities. I mentioned the guy who was very seriously injured before, by way of illustration. And just at the start of his long and disgraceful story with respect to the MOD, he was told, first of all, well, mate, the thing is, you may be sat there with pipes coming out of you, unable to move, bullets in your heart, and other injuries which might identify. I'm not going to give those. Very serious. But, you're a reservist, so you don't get anything, I'm afraid. So that's the first thing he was told, lying in bed after his first of dozens of operations, try and sort him out. Now, eventually that got rectified, but it took 3 years of utterly disgraceful obstruction and frankly, lies by the MOD to get him proper compensation. And as I said, this is a guy with all the social capital, all the connections you could ever want with lawyers and all kinds of clever people who can help him and all his mates. And many people don't have access to that. Now, I admit that's probably an extreme example. It's quite early on. It was in the mid 2007, 8, 9, 10. But he will say now that despite his visible and, put it mildly, life-changing, life-upending injuries, the worst part of that process was dealing with the Ministry of Defence. Now, as I said, it's conceivable that's changed. I seriously doubt it, but it may have done. But whether it has or not, as a matter of justice, that has to be mentioned. I'm very look. Like I said, this is not going to be full of mirth and joy. This stuff.
No.
So that's the cost to us for a start. There's a lot more where that came from. Now, if you want to go on to Afghan costs, I'm very happy to do so. Human costs.
Yes, I think we should, because, it's an important part of the conflicts itself, of course.
Right. So all of my figures come from talking to our people or indeed delving into government statistics. So Helmand's at 1.5 million people. We killed many thousands of Helmandis. And of course, it wasn't just us, it was the Americans. Now, the figures aren't clear. I established absolute nailed-on certainty. About 1,000 civilians up till 2011, I think, we'd killed that shouldn't have been killed through accident or so-called collateral damage. Bearing in mind, we shouldn't have been there in the first place, never been invited, and 95% of the people of Helmand didn't know why we were there, right? They're not simple people. I don't want to patronise. There's no more simple than you or I. But they didn't understand why a foreign force, because they don't have radio or they do have radio, they don't have internet, they don't have television. It's a rural society. Their skills and lie in the tilling of the land, in the drawing of mostly opium out of the land, by the way. But that's our problem, not theirs. That's the best thing they can do. Most of them are extremely poor. And then what happens one day is they hear that the British are here. Well, for them, the British are the bogeymen. They're like the Germans in Russia, let's say, or the Russians in Ukraine. That's how they're seen. Now, whether we see ourselves like that, of course, we don't. We see ourselves as the Brits, the good guys, the redcoats, and all that. And but they don't. They see us as the people who appeared 3 times in Helmand over the last 150 years, which isn't a very long time. We're usually seen off. We weren't actually militarily seen off. We usually defeated our enemies, but that's not the point. From their perspective, we come along, we burn a few things, we kill lots of people, we get involved in fights, and then we move out. And they see us as having been defeated, rightly or wrongly. And now we're back for the 4th time. And this time, worse than ever, because now we're staying. So, for example, I spoke to, when I was there, got on quite well with the ambassador because he was my boss. And we were having a chat one day, and I told him something I'd heard from some Afghan friends. And they told me that the belief of most Helmandi people, Afghans in Helmand, was that we were in Helmand to take revenge for a particular battle that had been fought, called the Battle of Maiwand, where we had been defeated, badly defeated. If you're in Reading, you'll know the Maiwand Memorial, the lion there. There's 600 names on it of British soldiers killed in 1879. And the feeling was we were there now to take revenge. And the token of revenge was this: we promised them, to the extent that they knew we promised anything, that all the soldiers said, well, we're here to help. We're here to build you new roads, health centres, hospitals, schools, girls' education and all that. And that's all great. But we hadn't done any of it. And yet they see these technical marvels like Chinook helicopters or jets fly around and huge amounts of explosives landing, lots of people being killed. And they think, well, they can afford to do all that, but they're not building roads like the Russians did, or hospitals like the Russians did, or dig ditches for them for irrigation like the Americans did 40 years ago. They're doing none of this. So they must be here to take revenge. They're promising things they know they can't deliver to give us hope. Anyway, so I outlined this to the ambassador, and he said, well, I said, they can't believe that, can they? And he said, yes, everyone believes that. Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, believes that. Right? The image we had of ourselves was of, we're here to help, essentially, or to see off the Taliban for you, which everybody apparently hated. That wasn't the case at all. We were seen as you would expect, invaders and murderous invaders at that. And that came as something of a shock to me. But anyway, that's the way it was. And of course, it got a lot worse as time went on. That's when I was there in 2007, by the way. That was the view taken. And as I say, it got worse. Just one other note about the Taliban. So most soldiers, I think, still think they were fighting the Taliban. Now, the Taliban were based in Pakistan. They had a leadership, a vague military command structure. They had a supply routes. They're extremely vicious and brutal, as we know now, and as we knew then, and rather effective. They're the Mujahideen from the old days. However, it's now clear that we weren't actually fighting the Taliban most of the time, and that a large percentage of people were just local guys, as would happen here if the Chinese army landed in Lincolnshire or Cornwall or Lancashire or London. Maybe not London, but, there would be resistance forces and people would fight them. And why wouldn't it be the same in Afghanistan when a bunch of foreigners in sandy uniforms who appear to use armed force with gay abandon, well, with let's say, that's wrong to say that, but occasionally causing damage that shouldn't be caused. You want to fight them. So probably, and I'm talking here, there's been very good scholarly work done, including by a close friend of mine who's now on the Defence Committee of Parliament. And most people weren't in the Taliban. They were local resistance fighters, and that's demonstrable now from all the research that's been done. So we were fighting local farmers who didn't want us there. But look, I think it's fair to say that most Green Army were, and this is where we get onto controversial grounds, were and are, and I'm talking here 99% of people, they don't commit war crimes, and they did their best. And I think we have to understand that a lot of those 1,000 people killed, at minimum, I think it's probably 10 times that, were genuine people, accidental injuries. I don't like that term, collateral damage. Doesn't matter what I like or not, that's what they say. However, there is another aspect to this, and this is where larger numbers come in, is that we had our special forces operating there. Now, they were doing a very different job from the Green Army, and a counterproductive job. Because where the Green Army in one village or another might have built relations in a very short time there, over 4 or 5, 6 months, the special forces, mostly the SAS, would then come in at night and kill a few people. And generally speaking, and I speak from some knowledge of this, having been an intelligence officer myself, but people with more knowledge tell me that much of the time, the intelligence was very poor. And so very many of and I'll give a number in a minute, of the people they killed should not have been killed. I could get into the intelligence details of how these things had happened, but essentially, unless you have a very knowledgeable, contextually aware, local and trustworthy local colleagues, very difficult to understand what's going on in a village or town, just as it is here. And there's an awful lot of the useful idiot syndrome going on. Now, I saw that in Iraq personally as an intelligence officer, where we'd be told something by somebody about some other people. Then you'd find that, having gone to arrest these people, you'd find that the ones who dobbed them in it were, say, rival car dealers, or wanted some land off them, or whatever. And our problem was with our intelligence, military intelligence, is that they tended to believe what they're told, because they only stay 6 months as well and have a clue really what's going on. And much of the time, shockingly, the information from previous tours was not passed on to them. Amazing. But there you have it. And the result was lots, not all, but lots of the people the SAS killed which should not have been killed. Now, there's the overlaying problem of that occasionally what would happen, and this is now, I'll go no further than this subject, let's say, of a major judicial inquiry, is the SAS would simply murder people, because they understood, and it's rational, it's vicious, but it's irrational, that if they captured somebody, their likelihood was they'd be out on the street again in 96 hours or in a few days, because of the way the justice system worked, not our system. And so they think, well, there's no point in us having to do this again, so we'll just kill them now. And there's many dozens of people, let's say, without being too, without being going over the top with it. But the problem with this was that worked against what the Green Army soldiers were doing in an awful lot of places. You can imagine, you've built a relationship with people in your local village, imagine your own town or village, and you're thinking, okay, maybe these guys aren't so bad after all, they are trying to help, they've got us some money for, a village centre or for primary school or whatever, and they're doing their best, and they're keeping the Taliban away, and we don't like them most of the time. And then they come in and they kill, the vicar and his family, right? Or the vicar and some friends who were staying with him, or the local captain of football club, right? By they don't have those things obviously in Helmand, but you see what I mean. Community people not well known in the community, or just the guy down the road. And you think, well, what the hell's this? And then the patrol will come in and say, what are you doing now? You murdered these people last night. What's wrong with them? They have nothing to do with the Taliban. And here's the issue, or here's the next issue. Those soldiers won't have known what happened, right? Because the SAS, of course, says they're much too important to tell the local army what they're doing, because that would be a security risk. Now, I'm characterising things in perhaps an extreme way, but to illustrate the problem. And this went on and on and on. So, to the figure. On official figures dug up by researchers, 3,000 people 1,000 people were killed at least by 2011. And bear in mind, the campaign went on for another 3 years by these special forces units in whatever outfit. I won't get into the details of what the operation they're involved in, because we're not dealing with that. At least 1,000 people killed in these raids by then, and another 2,000 captured or injured. Right, that's a huge figure in a province of 1.5 million. So that's Northern Ireland. So what we've got is in Northern Ireland, let's say in Northern Ireland, you have at least 1,000, probably 10,000, right? Because I saw dozens and dozens and dozens of people killed when I was there who should not have been killed in mistaken air raids or little babies shot or at checkpoints or somebody gunned down by mistake or bombs dropped on carts, this kind of thing. Most of those aren't reported, so I can assume there are hundreds and hundreds more of those. But anyway, a figure of, let's say, several thousand killed that shouldn't have been killed by accident or mistake, and another 1,000 killed by the SAS, and that all this this is half of the campaign, right? 2006 till 11, and in a 1.5 million people. So you look at that. That's before we get to the combat casualties of resistance fighters or Taliban or whatever you want to call them. And the army would claim vast numbers of these in combat because everybody wants to have a high casualty body count. The body count, of course, bore no relation to the actual casualties. None. A good friend of mine, again, I'm sorry about, come to a close now. I'm not going to rant on much longer on this. But I was talking to a good friend of mine who knew Helmand extremely well. Let's put it that way. Extremely well. He knew all the major figures, deeply involved with the community. He'd lived there for years, British guy. And he was telling me about the first year. And the brigade then, there were two brigades. That brigade is about 3,000 people. And we'd rotate these every 6 months, putting massive strain on the army, by the way. Army was threaders, and it ruined the British Army, and it ruins it to now. But that's a separate point. We're talking about costs here. And, there'd be a shootout in, let's say, Sangin. There's a particular case in Sangin. The paratroopers there would say that, well, they killed several hundred Taliban. And so my friend who knew Sangin quite well and knew all the leaders and what have you, he had much better sources than they had. They weren't willing to listen to him because, he might tell them things he didn't want to know. And this, by the way, a very patriotic guy with a very distinguished service globally, right? Let's put it that way. And he said, yeah, well, the thing is about dead people that and people shot in combat, just like us, those people get buried, and they get buried with ceremony. There are funerals and graves. And there were, I think he said, that this particular incident, 17 funerals of these people, and the evidence of some other bodies taken over the border. So the British Army would say, we killed X hundred people, and in the real count is probably a couple of dozen. So, all right, so when we come down to it, we've got many thousands. And my figures only go up to about 2012-13 of civilians killed who shouldn't have been killed. Baseline 1,000, which is quite enough, but it's, as I say, it's probably 10 times that amount. So most people didn't report their dead to the British anyway, and certainly didn't go looking for compensation, right? Because if you go to a British base looking for compensation, to which you are theoretically entitled, the real Taliban took a very dim view of people who went into British bases, and you wouldn't be guaranteed a happy ending to that. So that's the cost to Helmandi people, which that's to summarise. Then they were ravaged on the one hand by their own corrupt and vicious government, most corrupt in the world. A government run by drug dealers. Your Chacos, let's say in Afghan terms, every bit as brutal as those and cruel. So they're the government that we were fighting for. Nothing democratic about them. A bunch of warlords, gangsters, and drug dealers, and we were supporting them. And then overlay that with killing of thousands of civilians and thousands more of resistance fighters who were fighting us because they felt we shouldn't be there. Quite understandable. And by the way, a lot of people I met people who thought we were Russians. because why wouldn't we be? They were there for 10 years, a few years ago. We looked the same, or pretty much the same, and wore the same uniforms and much the same weapons and armoured vehicles and things like that. They're not army nerds and be able to tell the difference between a warrior and a BMP. But the difference, of course, was that the Russians would build roads. And by the way, the reason for that was they were willing to take casualties, civilian and military, which we weren't, to achieve that. So that's the cost to the Afghan people. There's a lot more detail in the book. And the cost to our own. And I'm not seeing any benefit out of either of these costs yet so far.
So in part 3, you move on to and for what, and I think that also leads on to the evacuation itself, doesn't it? And how and that process. What conclusions do you draw in terms of what was achieved, and also ultimately the evacuation?
Nothing was achieved. Zero. The evacuation was a chaotic disaster, which evinced some skills on the part of our military, but given that this was essentially a non-combatant evacuation operation within a challenged perimeter. By the way, carried out by paratroopers. Really, this was the sort of thing the RAF should have been doing as an organisation. There were political issues behind that, by the way. It's quite interesting. But look, that's an internal military squabbling. Enough to say it was carried out very well by whoever did it. But as for what was gained, no, nothing was gained. We killed a lot of people. We sustained a lot of casualties. And I'll just be blunt and truthful about it. There's no sugarcoating this. I mean, sometimes we hear, well, we sent some girls to school for some years. Well, we didn't. We didn't build any schools that are certainly none that are still standing or used as schools. In towns and villages in the Helmandi countryside, you weren't going to send girls to school, or sometimes boys either. They were required elsewhere. And I remember one woman, Helmandi woman, who was one of the provincial councillors, coming in one day, very intelligent, impressive lady, and it's her home, right? And she said, the thing is about you lot, this period now, it's nice you're here and all the democracy and everything, and it's nice, even 2 women on the provincial council, that's good too. That never happened before under the Taliban. But the thing is, sometimes I look at the stadium and in Lashkargah, which is the capital of Helmand, where we were, and I think, do you know what? It would be nice to have those executions back, because we had no crime then. And now I can't let my son out of the house because he will be kidnapped, and my daughter the same. And let's not forget, by the way, that's what she said. Well, you may not approve of it. That's the way it was. And it's also worth remembering that it's not the Taliban that prevent girls and women from being educated. It's Pashtun culture. And this is not a Taliban thing. It's a Pashtun thing. Again, not welcome to many people. I'll give an example. Some people may remember the picture of the girl with her nose cut off. It was on the front of Newsweek or Time. And the headline was, "This is what happens when the Taliban are allowed to rule." Well, it wasn't. That area where she was, there weren't any Taliban. She had her nose cut off by her uncle because she left the house one day, and when she shouldn't have. And I came across as justice advisor, let's say, I think it's fair to say, dozens of cases of similar kinds of brutality to women who stepped out of line whilst we governed, or supposedly supported the government of Helmand. I'm not putting a good word in here for the Taliban, but their rule has a different foundation than Pashtun rule, right? And equally brutal, but from our perspectives, no better for women. Neither one or the other is good for women as we see now. But it was not markedly different when we were there. That's a myth. And as for the schools and so on, we built some of those that were either destroyed or used for something else. And that's before we get to the prodigious corruption that went on and misuse of state funds, UK funds, by our local collaborators. I could go into some detail about that, having dished out some of those funds, mostly against my will, frankly. But no, it didn't achieve anything. And the thing is, there's been quite a lot of effort now for people to go back to Helm and see what's been achieved. I quite like to do that myself. It was safe to do so, and I think it probably is safe to do so. But I think, in common with everybody else, it's been back to Helm and to see what's been achieved, or see if there's anything left. The answer is nothing left.
That's a very, very sobering thought, Frank. As before we started recording, I said to you, having read the book, and it is a difficult read because for all the reasons you've already described, but also many of the people that we know and work with have served in Afghanistan, and I can't help but think, how will they feel upon hearing this and what you've had to say?
Well, they should feel angry, like I do. Doesn't matter how I feel, but we should be angry that we were led into that, following Iraq and followed by Libya, by leaders who failed to undertake a basic assessment of what it was we were trying to achieve and whether we had the resources to do so, and whether we were willing to be involved with it as long as it takes, as Cameron said and as Brown said. And we heard the same again about Libya. We had it in Iraq as well. And we're hearing it now about poor Ukraine, where I've spent several months over the last 2 years. We're in it for as long as it takes. Well, what is it we're in for? The lesson we can draw from this, and to the extent it's positive, we have to draw some lessons from it. So we have to understand basic strategy. What is it we're trying to achieve? Do we have the resources realistically to do so? What are the factors that impact on those? In terms of operations like Helmand, which God forbid we ever get involved in again, are we the people to do it? Do we have a sufficient understanding of the cultural environment, the ecology into which we're going to plunge and influence? Now, I do know that this comes across as extremely negative, and I'm sorry, I just cannot, and there may well be other people who can come up with something, but I don't think there are many really. But what we have to do is understand basic strategy, that the rhetoric of our political leaders will not translate into real effect on the ground, whether it's at the high military end or the contingency end that Helmand represented, unless there's a realistic appreciation, a proper real appreciation that of the realities in the place into which you're going to plunge, which is a complex ecology. And if you intervene and interfere with a complex ecology when you have no idea what you're doing and have no means to understand the effect of what you're doing when you're there, which is to say, sort of broad-based open source, also to translate to military terms, all source intelligence and awareness and all that. But basically, if you don't really know what you're doing there and trying to achieve at the highest level, political level, you've no business being there in the first place. And Helmand is an extreme example of what happens when that's the case.
You said people should be angry, but I'm also thinking about whether would say, for example, a public inquiry be appropriate to maybe help with some closure on any of this? Is there value in that?
Yes, huge value. Same as there was for the Chilcot inquiry, which was very ruminant and slow. But you know what? That produced some great lessons. Not least in terms of I don't want to get into this doctrinal planning documents for the military, which by and large now are being used or taught at that medium staff college level, but also in the civil service level. The Good Operation, for example, anyone can look that up on the internet. It's a really good document. Chilcot report was largely, I think it was a bit mild, and obviously didn't result in anybody being held accountable. But something like that for Afghanistan, I think, was absolutely even more essential. It was a much more costly campaign. It was 5 to 10 times more costly. Far more casualties. We killed lots more people. Politically, it was disastrous. And I was part of a movement for a year or so with some very significant people who are very significant now. They're in Parliament now. And we all tried to get an inquiry, and no one was interested. Always problems and restraints. Well, don't you understand? And perhaps we should look at this more closely, and this reason and that reason. Of course, there should be an inquiry. There won't be, but that's the way the British government works. Now, by the way, I know we're probably closing on time, but just by way of comparison, the Israelis. Now, whatever you say about the Israelis, they learn from their mistakes. Once this particular conflict is over, immediately there's going to be a wash-up an honest wash-up of what went wrong and who's responsible, and deal with those people to make sure, try and make sure whatever it is that went wrong doesn't happen again. And the results, but they did that in 2006. Chief of Staff of the Army was fired. So lots of staffs. They completely changed their approach. And what happens? Well, let's see what happens. But let's say the first couple of months it was a war in Lebanon, by the way, I'm talking about. First couple of months in Lebanon showed they learned those lessons and they moved very quickly and reasonably effectively then. Now let's see how it goes on. They're making some of the mistakes they made before. My point is they deal with things quickly and they deal with things efficiently and they make sure that people are held accountable who should be held accountable. Now, we're having a little bit of that with the Haddon Cave inquiry into the SAS. But you know what? What's going to happen there, Steve, is that, sorry, I'll rephrase. Let me put it this way. I suspect, looking at previous similar, I won't say inquiries, but proceedings, what's going to happen is, as in Australia, it'll all be a terrible fuss about how many people the SAS killed, and they'll nail a couple of low-ranking people for murder or something like that, and those who are responsible and accountable and in command of those operations. Of course, we didn't know anything about it, and we saw the lights blinking red. No cover-ups. They will carry on into their board memberships on arms companies or august charitable posts. Quiet, and they'll sail on into the future as they always do.
Mm. So, in terms of legacy of all of this, do you think, or rather, how has this impacted our international standing and or how other nations look at this? I mean, do you think the Russians would have looked at this and thought, they won't last the course in Ukraine in terms of support? It's like you said, we're in it for the long haul. Has Afghanistan had an impact on our global standing and position?
A four-star American officer visited, I think it was General Keane, visited Sandhurst about 10 years ago. And there's a conference. Sandhurst is the military academy for the army, but they often have conferences there of army officers. And so this was one such conference, and he stood up on the stage. I think Jack Keane is the name of this guy. I think, or maybe I think it was him. Anyway, a very senior American. He said, "Gentlemen, you let us down." And from the American perspective, we're no longer to be trusted as a first tier army. Indeed, only last year the American army said that we don't see the British army as a first tier army now, second tier army perhaps. Now the results of that are very profound militarily. Previous to the Iraq and Afghan wars, on both occasions the Americans had to bail us out at great cost. I don't want to get into the details of that because we're not here to talk about that, but enough to say that they did. And but it's had a more profound effect as well. I see the roots of our failure in Ukraine, which is looming quite quickly, in Afghanistan. The army has been allowed to wither on the vine. It's poorly armed, poorly prepared. It's tiny. Its people are treated poorly. And I'm talking here really also across the board. I deal with the Air Force all the time. And constant argument there is, you know what, you'll get your recruitment will improve and morale will improve and efficacy will improve when you start to treat your junior ranks properly. Same for the Army, no doubt, and the Marines and the Navy. But anyway, that's a massive point. My point is this: 20 years of these grinding ourselves into the dust in these useless operations has resulted in the military across the board being completely unfit to deal with high-end combat. And that ranges across from doctrine through to capabilities, training and weaponry. And only now are we trying to put that right. So the real cost of Afghanistan, apart from all the horrors that we've already described, is that the British Armed Forces are no longer capable of defending us properly.
Wow. That is a sobering thought by any standards. Frank, I would just like to say thank you so much. I mean, I can feel the anger. I mean, I can feel the anger and the frustration in the pages, when I was reading this. And obviously, this is something you passionately care about, and I can tell by the way you're talking about it. And I just want to thank you for your time, for sharing your thoughts. And I look forward to where you go next with your stories. But if you can get into Afghanistan, I'd love to read about that.
Well, look, Steve, thanks very much. I know I come across as a bit of a ranter, but it's. I just think that there's nothing good came out of this, and we just have to start putting things right. That's the message. But in order to put things right, you have to understand where you went wrong and where we are now, and that's the way it is. Oh, one other thing, if I might, Steve, while we're here, the thousands of soldiers that are damaged by this war, they're still out there, and they're still in shelters if they can get them, or some of them on the street, or living alone at their houses, or looking out of the window. That's not the majority of veterans. The vast majority get on with their lives. Everybody's fine, but there's a small minority, of course, who aren't fine. So if you know anyone like that, anybody listening, just say hello and give them be their friends. Because those people, and there are probably a few thousand of them around, maybe more than a few thousand, damaged either psychologically, and you'll know if they are, you'll find out pretty quickly, or physically. They will not be getting the proper help, psychological help, or probably prioritize physical help that they should do. So bear them in mind. They're still here, right? They're still here. The war's over, but they're still here. And given what I know about the British government, they won't be getting, and the health service, they won't be getting the care they need from those. So try and give them some care yourself if you can.
I think the whole, as we said before, when we spoke before we started recording, the whole purpose of this podcast is to recognise the service of those that were deployed to Afghanistan, and encourage people to talk about their experiences and try and get support. And that's very difficult if we're not actually talking about the conflict itself, of course. Why would you start talking about things that nobody else is talking about?
Right, yeah, and it's dead easy, isn't it? Easy. Oh, we'll move on from this now. It's old news. Forget about it. It's a legitimate point. Fair enough. But you're not going to be very well equipped for the next time, then, are you?
No, and I bet the people who served haven't forgotten about it.
No, they certainly haven't. I haven't either, for what it's worth.
Frank, there's no doubt that this is a difficult story, but do you get any pushback on this? Because you obviously move in military circles.
The first, I was expecting to get that, especially my first book, Losing Small Wars, which was very critical of the senior command, and I was expecting pushback. The first response I got was from a former squadron commander in the SAS, who said on an email, "You've done your country great service." Now, I don't see that, but that was literally the first response, because he was the first. I sent it to him and some of his colleagues to read and see what they thought. And since then, of course, I've talked to thousands of people live in military units and staff college and training centres and military bases and all that, and indeed bases abroad. And I think I'm always expecting chest poking from operational people, people below the rank of colonel, or warrant officer, and I hardly get any. Now, why that is, I don't know. I hardly get any. I would say 3 to 5% of people, I would say violently disagree, but robustly disagree, which is to say they make themselves known. Not saying 95% of people agree. I don't think that's the case. But as a token, to be fair to the military, I was invited constantly, as I say, to army bases, etc., Navy, Air Force, Marine bases, to give talk with much the same message that you've just heard, perhaps in more measured tones. But no, I get very little pushback. And on the contrary, you get a lot of people saying, well, that's how I think about Iraq and Afghanistan together. And again, that maybe that's my impression. Like I say, in fairness to the military, because I was very critical about their open networks and the way they think and culture and all that. I think that's true. It's a very bureaucratic and ossified institution. However, the people in it are dynamic, intellectually engaged, conceptually engaged, because it's their profession. They're highly professional. And I think that's reflected, and they may not agree with everything that one says, but that they're able to engage with it positively, because they're a profession and highly professional. So no, I haven't got much chest poking Some pushback, yes, especially from very senior officers who don't come off very well from my books, I think. And they take exception to that. And I've had a few arguments with them, but I've had no stand-up rows with anybody below the rank of colonel, I think, or anyone else, really. I mean, you don't have a stand-up row with a 3-star general. You have a robust discussion.
Frank, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing this. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Steve. It's been an honour.
Well, Tip, that was quite a chat, wasn't it? I think I found it really difficult listening to what he had to say because it brings into question so many different things about our involvement in Afghanistan, not just as a country, but obviously for those that have served. I think the most noticeable thing was he was obviously very cross, if I'm putting it politely.
Yeah, I mean, I feel his anger now. I mean, I'd say it was damning, passionately damning, because you can see he's passionate for our countries, for our culture, and he was a lawyer representing the government. So yeah, I mean, it was really, really hard. I mean, his background, being a lawyer, obviously a naval reservist, Bosnia, Iraq, working for security and justice of the UK government, and yeah, I mean, everything he said there I think it's damning in a way because it was very, and you could see he didn't want to do this, so he's lent into it and he's written it, and it was hard for him to write because it's about us as a people, us as a cultural identity, us as a society, and it was, well, in fact, it was apart from which. I'm so glad he was passionate about our service people and how they are professional and how they deliver what they're expected to. But it's damning for everything else. And the cost, both in lives and finance, not only for the Allied forces, but you think for the Afghan people, it's immeasurable, really.
I think also it's important to recognise this is his research, this is his journalism, if you want to call it that, and I think that's the way he's approached this. But I think, we've talked about this off air, we've talked about this, that other people's individual experiences could also be quite different in terms of they would have had positive experiences in terms of what they've done for the Afghan people by being deployed there. So it's important to understand that whilst he's looking at very much at the big picture, I think some people, our listeners, may hold slightly, if not very different views in many ways.
No, it's always the case. I feel, it could be, is it bureaucratic? Is it academic? Is it hindsight that people look at and go, yes, all these problems? What about the forward thinking? What about the people that made the decisions? As far as my experiences, which have always been on the ground with the people that are engaged with either the enemy or the local population, it's been very different. Like, we spoke before in the Iraq podcast, when we arrived on the L4, we were saviors, we were liberators, and that soon changed. I mean, was that our fault? We were saviors, we were liberators, and the same in Afghanistan. When we first arrived there in 2001, 2002, we were visiting, having shuras in small villages up in the Hindu Kush, in eastern Afghanistan, up in the mountains, and. On the general area, we hadn't reached Helmand yet, but the vibe we were getting was they were happy people, or the tribes and the people we spoke to, and some of them were quite obviously Taliban, were glad to see us. And I even met an elder up in eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border, and he was in charge of a madrasa, and he was quite obviously Taliban, but he said to me that there was good Taliban and bad Taliban. And I was like, well, his English was perfect, which I know he was well educated and probably actually educated in the United Kingdom as well. And we had a good chat. It was, I asked and tried to give him some support of what we would need in the village to, help the community, whether it be water, whether it be, any sort of like support for his school as well. And he said no, they were looked after, they were happy, and like that sort of played with me all my time, afterwards when I did deploy to Afghanistan again. And it came to, I was back in the southwest, and I had a couple of beers in a pub, and I jumped in a taxi, and the taxi driver was from Afghanistan. His English was really good, and he told me he was a former interpreter, and he got out, before things, went wrong in 2021. And I said to him, well, I met this guy once, and he said there's good Taliban and bad Taliban. And his face he gave me a look of pure dread and loss. He says, there's no good Taliban. They've destroyed my country. So you see, and with him, he was a workaholic. He was working in a hospital. He was working in a taxi driver. He had his family. He was looking after him. And I just thought, this incredible guy, he's given up everything, come back over here, and he's working, grafting his backside off to look after his family. And he still has a passion for what he and his people have lost in Afghanistan. So it's two sides of the coin. And I think, although Frank's book and his message, you can see how passionate he is about what he's written. But I couldn't help, it's wrong of me, but I couldn't help but feeling angry. And it's not about Frank, but it's about that whole level of what person or what, entity should have grabbed it and made it proper so that the efforts and the sacrifices of our people was done. And I'm not a politician, and I don't even want to be political in this, and I'm not pointing fingers or blaming. I'm just saying there's some sort of maybe, cultural misunderstanding that maybe, but before I deployed in Afghanistan, we did do, cultural training. Initially, it was all, self-help, find out what was going on, what the people were about. But by the time, towards the end or towards 14, 17 for the Corps, there was a big education pack as such given for people to read and take on board to understand the different tribal and cultures within Afghanistan. So not only pan-Afghanistan, but obviously individual tribal areas. People I met, the good people of Afghanistan, they just wanted exactly the same as us. They wanted education, they wanted to feed their family, their kids, they wanted a little treat every once in a while. That's what they wanted. There wasn't much in life. They just wanted life, and they wanted the best for their family. And you could sort of superimpose that around, I think, all the places I visited in the globe, and that's what human beings want. They don't want war. And if they do, that needs to be, taken out of whatever, their cultural identity. You can't. If it is their identity, it is their identity. But I don't want that. I don't want, that to feed, our freedoms that we've got, and, the passion we have and the compassion we have, when hopefully we never lose that. Even though I think globally we're frowned upon now, I just want us to maintain, what our rights and wrongs are.
I think as well, when we talk with James Glancy, and he's taught in his film, which is well worth a watch, he talks about the young people that have grown up in those 20 years, and they have very different aims and aspirations than perhaps their parents did, as most young people do. And I think, the message coming out of that was the idea of wanting peace and some form of civil liberties that fits into Afghanistan culture, Afghani culture.
Yeah, in Afghanistan, there's very different tribal elements, but holistically, the Afghan people are incredible. And it's such a historic and beautiful, wonderful place and when I was there, both the first time and, the last time, I came across evidence in old buildings with photographs, information of life before, the Russian invasion, before, the jihadist rule, before the Mujahideen. And we've got to respect, because these have been our allies at certain stages, and before the Taliban. And it was very Western. Was it superficially Western? I don't know, because I wasn't there at the time. But there did seem to be a lot of pictures of people going about, I'd say it looked like a 1950s, 60s classic film. You were expecting Tony Curtis or to walk around the corner, and these young ladies were all glammed up, working in offices, doing jobs, and young men wearing suits and things like that. And obviously it's went full circle. But I'm not to judge in that though, because it's not my culture. But people, human beings, wanting simple freedoms for themselves and their families, I think is a fundamental want, but a fundamental right, I think, for every human being.
Mm-hmm. I think we'd all agree with that. I guess it's the soul searching that's required about not what we were trying to do, but how we were going about it, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can actually measure the soul searching maybe to the people that are suffering from the conflict.
Mm.
And, a lot of my friends and a lot of my friends will understand that we've lost a lot of fellow veterans and Afghan veterans who've taken their own lives. And again, it's one of those things I feel I can empathize, but I'm not in their headspace, and for them to be driven to what they've done it's very hard to comprehend. But I want to assist, and I want to make sure that they open up, and whatever demons they're fighting, and if it is to do with their actions in any sort of operation, just come forward and talk about it.
100%. I mean, that's the only way of solving it, isn't it? Is talking about it and not taking that final step, I think. So if you've listened to this and found this to be particularly difficult, as I'm sure many have, there are lots of options for getting support in the description of the podcast. But if you do nothing else, please talk to someone.
Before you go, if you're a member of the Armed Forces community and need support with your mental health, Op Courage can help. Use the link in this podcast description for details. Or you can phone the Combat Stress Helpline on 0800 138 1619. If you'd like to contact us, email studio@companyofmakers.com.
Finally, we're giving a really big shout out to our funders. They support all the activities that we provide for the well-being of those who've served. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines Charity, Greenwich Hospital, Arts Council England, and the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. Thank you.
This podcast was produced by Rachel Owen, hosted by Tip Cullen and me, recorded and edited by yours truly.
Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.